decades researching this material, and it is a great honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce to you David Steinmetz. Vyasa.
Thank you very much. When Riemann invited me to come here and talk, he asked me to talk about the part that's in the appendix to the book. And this is a great pleasure for me because I'm often asked not to talk about that part. It's difficult to understand sometimes. And also, I want to be able to share with you this evening something of my journey with the Yugas, and give you some flavor of what it's like to research some of the more obscure parts of the description of the Yugas that Sri Yukteswar has left us. So just a little bit of background. I first read the Holy Science in the mid-'60s, and I was a little dubious. It seemed to conflict strongly with some things I learned in astronomy, and that was my specialty at the time. And of course it turns history upside down, so it took me a little while to really get into it. By the 80s I was teaching about it, but my emphasis was on the technology and the descending Yugas, which is pretty interesting, but you know, there's got to be more to it. By the 90s I was beginning to think about a book. Swami Kriyananda had suggested a book, and began to do some pretty serious research into it. The book accumulated. It got to be too ponderous and not really appropriate for the beginnings of things. So then we teamed up with Joseph Selby, Purushottama, and the book you've been reading is the result. But they let me write the appendix all by myself. So that's where we'll start. But when I first was beginning to research the Holy Science, I didn't know its history. I wasn't sure it had been written in English. Was the reason it was hard to understand because it was written in some other language and translated poorly, or what was going on? Until one day, Dan Hart, who was passed away not too long ago, came to my house and presented me with a Xerox copy of the 1920 edition of the Holy Science. Now, Sri Yukteswar wrote it in, 1894, but apparently didn't do much with it until 1901 when he began to publish it in his monthly bulletin of his little organization, and then the printer in 1920 gathered it together as a book and put it out. The book you buy today of the Holy Science is, its description of the Yugas is edited for improved readability, but I stick to the 1920 edition because I don't want my understanding to be filtered by the editor's understanding. And that's worked out pretty well. What we're going to concentrate now on is a few of the most obscure passages in that little part of the introduction to the Holy Science that describes the mechanism behind the Yugas. So here's what he explains, and we'll come back to this slide a few times because we're going to look at the individual parts. He says the sun and its planetary system revolves about a grand center, which he calls Vishnu Nabi. And that's the center of creative power, Brahma, the universal magnetism. So this is very mysterious. What's the universal magnetism? What is Brahma? What is the seat of Brahma? And what's Vishnu Nabi? That translates as Vishnu's navel. All right. Then he says it's this Brahma, the universal magnetism, that regulates Dharma through the cycle of the Yugas. So here we are, some distant center with some magnetism is affecting our consciousness. This is getting really interesting. Well, went back to the creation story in Hindu mythology, which talks about Vishnu rides on a sea, the Milky Sea, on a snake with many heads called Sisha. And out of his belly comes a lotus. And from inside his belly, up through that stalk, comes Brahma and sits on the lotus. So here's Vishnu's navel, and there's the seat of Brahma. It's even more bizarre. In one account, it talks about how he invited Brahma into his belly to understand the galaxies and the cosmos. And he poked around in it for a while and then came out through the navel. By the time you leave, I think you're going to understand what this might be all about. Well, here's an artist's rendition of our galaxy. It's got a bar in the middle. It's got 2 arms or maybe 4. And if you look closely, you might see Vishnu there on the snake with many heads in the Milky Sea. We call it the Milky Way, don't we? And if you have you're the Hubble telescope plus, and you were to somehow look at the interior of our galaxy, according to what people think is there right now, and you zoom in there, you would find what they're calling a black hole. And this black hole will have, in general, and most galaxies seem to have these, a bunch of energy coming up in 2 directions. And magnetic fields, strong currents, a plasma, stuff going on there. Well, if this is Vishnu's navel, maybe this is the lotus, huh? In fact, they're beginning to understand now that galaxies are formed by this black hole. For a long while there was a question. Which came first? The center of the galaxy, this black hole thing, whatever that is, or was it the galaxy itself? And they've come to realize now that somehow or another this central thing, this black hole, is actually governing the formation of the galaxy. And here's one case, this is an artist's rendition, but it's the interpretation of real data, that a black hole here has its energy coming out here and actually forming a galaxy in space in front of it. So this is the center of creation. It's beginning to come together. Here's the jet from M8. This is a galaxy. And look at this jet. Comes out here, and it gets brighter as it gets further out. And the velocity is coming out here is like the velocity is close to the speed of light. So this is no small matter. Well, we puzzled over this for a long while. And then I ran across the work of Halden Arp. Halden Arp is an astronomer who just passed away in December of last year, he was studying peculiar galaxies, strange galaxies that had funny shapes, and trying to understand what they are. And what he found was so disagreeable to his colleagues that they prohibited him from having a telescope time and pushed him out of the work, and he went to Germany, which for the rest of his life. So this is seeing red doesn't mean that he's angry about it. It has to do with this notion of red shift. The light from the stars has spectral lines that identify different elements in them, and if those are kind of shifted to the red, which they are generally, it's interpreted as moving away from us. So we have the expanding universe. It's the Doppler shift. You're all accustomed to that. You know, the siren that comes to you at a high pitch and goes away at a low pitch. So if it's going away from you, it's shifted to the red, to the lower frequencies. And these are almost universally interpreted as velocity, receding velocity. And he says, not so. Here's what he found. In case after case, he found a galaxy had these objects called quasars, which are very small galaxies that have really bright, they're quite bright, and they're redshifted. And, of course, they'd be interpreted as being very distant. But he found in case after case that the ones that they lined up along the axis of the galaxies, and the ones nearest had higher redshifts than the ones further away. And he said, something's going on here. These things seem to be related to these galaxies. Well, here's one. You can get an idea of it. There's a galaxy in here, but this is a radio picture, so you can't see the visual part. And the jets are coming out in both directions, and something is forming over here. It's beginning to look like a lotus. All right? So here's what the theory develops that comes out of this. He says, here's a galaxy, and out of the jet is formed these quasars, which start out small and very, very redshifted. Then the matter that's being created gets older and changes its frequency, and it becomes more massive and moves away. So we have decreasing redshift as you go out, till the thing gets so massive that it begins to be attracted by gravity now back to the galaxy that it came out of. And galaxies they find eat their neighbor galaxies, and so it's returned to the womb of the mother galaxy. It sounds a bit like Brahma going into the belly of Vishnu before he comes out and forms another galaxy. This all fits together. See? That's really exciting to me. Anyway. Now, the ancients knew about the center of the galaxy. We can tell when we look at the constellations. Here's Sagittarius, and he's shooting his arrow toward the center of the galaxy. And Scorpio's stinger is ready for it. So that kind of zeroes in on where it is. You can't see it. I measured it once with a telescope, a little infrared detector, and you could tell it was there, but there was nothing to see there at all. But how did the ancients know about the center of the galaxy? Not only that, how could they have known about this way galaxies might have been formed? Of course, that's just Arp's theory, and it's so many people are invested in the notion of the expanding universe and the redshift being only due to the motion outward that his ideas aren't accepted. But they might be someday. Going back to that explanation again, see what else we can see. He says, we learn from Oriental astronomy that the sun takes some star for its dual, and the sun and the dual revolve around each other in about 24,000 years. Important, you notice he says about. All right, we'll come back to that. This is the picture that in most people's minds comes from that statement. You have the sun and the solar system. You have some other star, he calls the dual, and the two rotate around each other. And there's this influence from somewhere, probably the galactic center, maybe not, but somewhere, a universal center. And when the sun is on the side nearest that center, it receives more energy, more enlightenment. And when it's further away, it receives less. And this is, if you've seen Walter Cruttenden's things, he shows a little more elaborate picture with elliptical orbits in an attempt to account for the varying lengths of the different yugas. And that's all fine and good. And when I first read about these things, and I look at it was 1960s and 70s, you could believe that there could be another star out there. The sun could be a double star. Many stars are, probably more than half of the stars are parts of multiple systems. So it wasn't unbelievable. And there were some discrepancies in the motions of the outer planets, particularly Neptune, I think. And so people speculated on a planet X or something out there, something big that was disturbing the planets. And so I watched the literature, and little by little, things got to clear up. When they got probes out to go around these outer planets, they got much better measurements of their mass, and the discrepancies disappeared. And there were lots of surveys from space, and they hadn't found anything. I began to get a little discouraged. Where is this duel? And then finally, in 2005, some research was done by some people at Princeton, again using this business of Doppler shift. Now, let me try to explain how they did what they did. You understand, again, if you were approaching something in your car, say, that is making a constant pitched noise, a siren or some sort, a constant pitch, and you begin to turn away from it, right? If you turned, it would diminish in its pitch, wouldn't it? Because you'd stop going to it quite so fast. Right? Or if there was one behind you that was being lowered in pitch because you were receding away from it, when you started to curve, it would begin to pick up a little bit. Well, there are objects in space called pulsars. These are stars that are collapsed. We call them neutron stars. And you know how a skater gets to spinning? They start out spinning like this, and they bring their hands in, and it spins faster, and then they want to stop. You put your hands out again. So when the star collapses to a very small fraction of its original size, it ends up spinning really fast, like 100 times a second. And these pulsars have, like, they're putting out energy, and it's like a little searchlight. And it goes around and around and around, and you pick up the pulses with the telescope and measure them. And so you could measure the frequency of this very, very accurately, because you get many cycles over a reasonable measurement time. And they notice they all diminish a little bit in frequency, because they're putting out energy, so they lose a little energy gradually. But if the sun's path were curved, these people postulated, then we would be seeing the pulsars in some directions slowing down more and other ones slowing down less. In other words, it's that Doppler effect. The pitch would be diminishing if you had been going toward it and you were being turned away from it. So these spinning pulsars would reflect that. So they looked at the pulsars all around the sky, and they couldn't find any indication that the sun's path through space is curved. Now, there's a limit to how accurate, or, how detectable, what the limit of detection is, but with their figures, I'm pretty sure that Yukteswar's dual would have been detected, because Yukteswar says it makes that circuit in 24,000 years. So if it has a mass that's comparable to the sun, you can see how big that orbit would be and how much curvature there would be, and it simply isn't there. So to me, that puts the nail in the coffin. The dual must be something else. Something else. Now, people have said to me, "Oh, don't try to understand Yukteswar. After all, he's a spiritual master, and he knows, and who are we to try to understand what he says?" Well, I think that if he wrote it down, he intended us to read it and understand it. Why would he bother? In fact, there was one part where he talks about the subtle magnetism of the Treta Yuga, and he says, "I'm not going to bother explaining about that," which implies that we should be able to understand everything else. All right? So, off I go. Got to look again at what this says. We learn from Oriental astronomy, the sun takes a star for its dual, they revolve around in 24,000 years, and this causes the backward motion of the equinoctial points around the zodiac. That's called the precession of the equinoxes. So, what is precession? It seems like just about every book now that comes out with alternate history and so forth has to explain, and mythology has to explain about the precession. So I guess we all ought to know about it. So very briefly, it's the Earth on its axis wobbling like a top running down. Now, the physicists explain this as the influence of the moon on the equatorial bulge of the Earth, and that's fine. It's well established. The bulge affects the moon too, and the moon's orbit does this same kind of a wobble on a much faster scale. So I can't really argue about that. But that's where it says it's caused by this motion around the non-existent dual. Boy, did I scratch my head on that one. Well, let's look at this more closely. This precession of the pole goes around like this. Here's the arc of the circle of where the North Star would be. Right now the North Star is Polaris, and back in the Satya Yuga it was Vega, and to the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, it was, where are we, Thuban. And here it is, Thuban, in the constellation of Draco. Draco, that's an interesting constellation. It's a snake. But you know, you could make a snake constellation in any part of the sky. You just string together a bunch of stars and call it a snake. But Draco's snake is coiled around the center of this circle. That's called the pole of the ecliptic. So this is the circle that is the path of that wobble. And of course it has a center. This is the center, and the center is marked out by Draco the dragon. The snake, whatever he is. The ancients knew about it. Now it moves, this moves 1 degree in 70 years, I think it is. Like a whole lifetime it would take to actually see much change. So a careful measuring astronomer will see the change. It isn't negligible. But on the other hand, it isn't obvious. And it would take quite a bit of measurement before you would know where the center of that motion was. But the ancients knew about it when they designed the constellations. Now I'm going to show you this map in a little different way in a moment. That kind of map is called a stereographic projection. And if you look at this map, which is probably more familiar to you, you can see that it shows things below the equator. Here's the equator. And in fact, you could show the entire globe on this kind of projection. Antarctica would be smeared all around the perimeter, which isn't very realistic, so they leave that off as a rule. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a star map that's just like that. Only this one, I've centered that star map on the pole of the ecliptic point that we've been seeing in the previous slides. And if that's the pole, where's the equator? The equator is the ecliptic, the path of the sun in the course of the year. And it's the line along the zodiacal constellations. Now, if you are familiar with the sky, you may notice this chart's backwards. That's only because I'm trying to make everything rotate in a clockwise direction so it doesn't get us all confused. Well, that's the equator of the this equator, this plane that in reference to the pole of the ecliptic is the plane of the Earth's orbit. Think of it that way. Well, then we have the equator of the Earth. You can imagine the equator of the Earth out into space and have its pole, and right now the pole is over near Polaris. That's our pole star, right? So this point where these lines cross is the equinox. So on March 21st, as a matter of fact, the sun, which follows the ecliptic, will cross the equator going north. Okay, it'll be right here. And right now, this equinox is in Pisces. As we've all heard that we're in Pisces and about to go to Aquarius. Well, that's where it is. This is the constellation of Pisces. Here's the fish. But what does it mean that it goes toward Aquarius? Well, let's start this in motion. And we can see the equinox is going around the circle. Right? This is the vernal equinox, the spring. This is the fall equinox, the autumnal equinox. And look at what's happening in here. We have 2 points rotating around each other. Okay? We have the pole of the Earth and the pole of the ecliptic. They're going around each other and geometrically causing this equinoctial point to move around the circle. Everybody see that? If you don't, raise your hand. I'll go over it again. I want everybody to catch that. This is the way in which the motion of the poles on the sky cause the precession of the equinox geometrically. See, we're not talking Newtonian physics here. We're talking geometry, which is what astrology is based on, right? Not physics, but astrology. Okay. Well, why did Yukteswar call this the pole? I'm sorry, the dual. Why didn't he just say pole when he meant pole? I couldn't figure it out. And I asked myself, well, what does dual mean anyway? So I looked it up in the dictionary. That's what you do when desperate for meaning. You look up in the dictionary. It isn't there. There's no noun. There's no noun use of the word dual in the dictionary. I looked at all the dictionaries. What's going on? I found one place where it was used, but in a very technical way, in a field called projective geometry, mathematics. Well, that doesn't seem, why would Yukteswar be using an obscure mathematical term in place of just plain old pole? So I went looking in the libraries for books on projective geometry. And they're full of stuff I couldn't understand. They have their own mathematical symbolic language for this, which is totally foreign to me. And so I got a little discouraged at that until I looked at my own bookshelf, which had a book on it that I had bought back in the 70s. So it'd been sitting there for 20 years or something, called Projective Geometry. Now, when I got it, I didn't make any sense out of it. It was just mostly just diagrams with lines going this way and that, and it didn't make a lot of sense either. So I, just been sitting on my bookshelf. Well, it was written by Olive Witcher, who with she was a mathematician, who with a mathematician named Adams, were devotees of Rudolf Steiner, and they developed this. And as I read the introductory part of this book, I came to this statement, which I can't quote, but just to paraphrase, it was to the effect that Rudolf Steiner said that it was through his study of projective geometry that he came to understand how psychic phenomena work. Telepathy and clairvoyance have something to do with projective geometry. Clue. We're connected with this consciousness again. We're not completely just in a math book. So I got to reading the book. Since that was, then there's a second edition which went out of print, and it's just come back into print now. And Witchers has two other books, one, a little one called The Idea of Counter Space, and the other one called Sun Space. Now, this idea of counter space is interesting. Let me try to explain what this idea of dual means in the mathematical sense. It leads to a very interesting conclusion and some clue as to what Steiner was talking about. Mathematically, they say in geometry, you say that two lines cross at one point. Right? This is just one of those axioms. But it's also true that 2 points are joined by one line. And so these two principles are considered duals of each other because you exchange the points and the lines in their role. So points are to lines as lines are to points. All right. Extend that to 3 dimensions, and you have a cube. The cube has 6 sides and 8 corners. But if you connect the centers of the sides, you get the octagon, octahedron rather, which has 8 sides and 6 corners. And one is the dual of the other. You've exchanged sides and corners. And then I gradually said, wait a minute, I've seen this before somewhere. And when I studied physics in school, they taught us about analyzing electronic circuits. And they did an interesting trick. Now, in an electronic circuit, you have current and voltage that you measure. You have resistance and capacitance and inductance. These are the parameters which define all the electronic circuits. And what my professors told me was that you could take these and exchange each of them, exchange current for voltage and voltage for current, resistance and conductance, inductance and capacitance. If you exchange these, then this mathematical problem maybe you can solve more easily. And you come across a circuit that you just can't figure out with these parameters, change them to those parameters, figure it out, and then change it back. That's the dual of this. Now, here's the point. Science, or our perception of the world, is but a description of the world. All we can do is describe the world. We see it. Even that image is a representation of something. People don't ask, what is it really? You can't really know what things are. You can only know what they appear to be. And so if you are able to change all the parameters and still have a real thing, what's going on? It's an alternate description of the same world, but with different values, different parameters altogether. And now we're getting closer to this notion that Witcher and was putting forward of a alternate space. Remember, she called it let me go back here. The idea of counter space. So it's, if there was an alternate kind of description of the world, they call counter space, the laws would operate within that just as they do in our description of the world, of the same world. Only if you exchange all the points for lines and lines for points, you find that everything is connected to everything. Center everywhere, circumference nowhere. This counter space is the description of the world in which, according to Steiner's thinking apparently, the world in which the psychic phenomena work. So that you can know something in the future or the past or the distance or in somebody else's mind, because there is this connection when you look at the world from the other side, from this counter space. I think it's a really remarkable thing. I don't pretend to really understand it yet, but it opens up a lot of things. And I begin to wonder now, did Yukteswar use the term dual to get us to thinking in these terms? Is this the kind of space, the kind of the description of reality in which the laws of things that affect consciousness operate? Now, I saw the word dual used in a slightly different context in the magazine Science, one of the most prominent science magazines in this country. And they were talking about string theory. Now, string theorists have had a really hard time trying to find any kind of physical test that would tell them their theory was right or wrong, because they know they're describing the world, but in a different way somehow. And the suggestion is that what string theory is a dual of the normal description of the world. And in that world, in that kind of description, you can't do physical experiments, because that's our other side of reality, the normal physics reality. So here's a suggestion that maybe the mathematicians, physics mathematicians are already nibbling away at this other kind of subtle world, which is our world seen from another perspective. This all gets very difficult to grasp, and it's given me a lot of things to think about. So I just just want to put that out there as kind of something that may be kind of on the horizon in people's thinking. Now, there's one place in Witcher's book where she says, well, when we talk about the relationship between points and lines, we'll use the word dual. But when we talk about the relationship between points and planes, we'll use the word pole to make that distinction. All right. Now we got a connection between dual and pole that's really firm. And in fact, on a sphere, the equator is a great circle, and of course it's going to have poles. And anything you do to the pole tells you what happened to the great circle, to the equator, and vice versa. So one is the dual of the other in that sense. All right, so it's beginning to pull together all these different little threads. Back to the explanation. We learn from Oriental astronomy. Haven't talked about that one yet, have we? Now, Oriental was the word used in Yukteswar's day for Eastern astronomy. So I got to find out about Eastern astronomy. Well, I spent a lot of time when I lived here. I spent a lot of time down there at the library, at the university. And I collected, I think, over 22-inch binders full of Xeroxed things that I pulled out of the books there. They have a wonderful collection of Eastern things. But one stood out in particular. One book really, really made a difference. This is a book called Ancient Indian Insights into Modern Science. And what the author does is compare modern physics with ancient descriptions. And you say, maybe these ancients really knew something. Well, that's fine. There are other books that do that too. But one part of it, in one place, she translated just a paragraph or two from another book written in the 50s by this Pandit Motilal Sharma. It's written in Hindi. It's full of Hindi and Sanskrit. I have a copy. We got it from the library in Pune. But she translated a little part of it. And when I saw the diagram that explained what was in that book, it was this. Now already you're probably seeing it. It says the moon goes around the earth goes around the sun goes around Parmesti. Parmesti goes around Swayambhu. That's a different language, but it's pretty much the same structure that Yukteswar was talking about. So let's look at the language. Swayambhu, self-existent, said of Brahma, independent. That sounds like this grand center, seat of Brahma. Okay, then we have Parmesti. It's the highest realm, the highest place. And it would correspond in this scheme, apparently, to the solar dual. That was interesting. But then it said that it goes around in the Ayana Vritta. Well, Vritta we know, it's from our discussions of yoga and the spine and the vrittis, circular motion. And the Ayana is the equinox, so it's the motion of the equinox. In other words, the ecliptic, the path of the equinoxes. So now we associated this Parmesti with the equinoxes, and it's the highest place. Parmesti, the highest place above the plane of the ecliptic. This must be the dual. This must be the pole, because if you're thinking of the horizon system, the highest place is the zenith, right? And if you're thinking of the plane of the ecliptic, the highest place is the pole of the ecliptic. So there we are. It seems as though this is the Oriental astronomy that Yukteswar was drawing on. And he says in the 1920 edition, he refers to it twice. He says what the Oriental astronomy is taught this, and then he says it also teaches this. So He's definitely drawing it from a source like this. The Shatapatha Brahmana is considered second only to the Vedas in importance in the Hindu scriptures. All right. More and more pieces are coming together in this story. And now we have the question of dates. Yukteswar said we're at the bottom of the Yuga cycle in 499 AD. Sounds really precise. And then he says the cycle takes about 2,400 years, And the astronomers know that the precessional cycle takes more like 25,700, something like that. And it varies. So he's very precise about this, and he wasn't very precise about things. This is inconsistent. What's going on here? Okay. Back to the library, studying the history of astronomy in India. Okay. Turns out it was this fellow called Aryabhata who lived right at the bottom of the cycle, 500 AD. And he made a statement that 3,600 years of Kali Yuga had passed, and on his birthday, I think it was, he was 23 years old or something like that, at the spring equinox, which occurred in 499 AD. All right? So that's the 499. That's where that came from. So here's Aryabhata living right at the bottom of the cycle. Now, here's the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, of course, is a discussion of the Mahabharata war, which occurred at the end of the Dwapara Yuga, and it was written down and then added to over time. And Yukteswar also refers to Manu, the laws of Manu, and gives a full translation of the part of Manu that describes the Yugas right there in the Holy Science. But Aryabhata came later, and he said that there were 3,600 years between a certain date in 3102, February 18 in our system. He wasn't using our calendar, but that's the way we'd express it. Between there and 299 AD, spring equinox, was exactly 3,600 years. 499, I'm sorry. Oh, that's an error, isn't it? Sorry. 499. I have to erase that somehow. He called it Kali Yuga because that's the belief, and that's a whole other story. Is why people in India think this is all Kali Yuga, and we think it's Dwapara and Kali. Well, I didn't know what that meant until I found this book by Richard Thompson. Now, Richard Thompson is a devotee of Prabhupada, of the Bhaktivedanta people. And his guru gave him an assignment. His assignment was to read a certain section of the Srimad Bhagavatam that was about astronomy of some sort and make some sense out of it. Well, I never met Richard, but I feel an empathy with him because he was doing pretty much what I was trying to do with the Holy Science. And he did a wonderful job. It's a fantastic book. I think it's out of print now, and I don't think it's received anywhere near the attention it deserves. But I'll tell you about one experiment that he did. He said, well, what was going on in February 18, 3102? You see, let me back up a minute here. An astronomer, in order to make predictions of the positions of planets a little bit in the future, starts with observations he makes right then. And then he needs some observations way distant in the past that don't have to be as accurate, but they have to be, fairly accurate. Then he can extrapolate the long distance or interpret the long distance and extrapolate a little bit forward with accuracy. Understand how that would work? So he assumed something about where the planets were on February 18, 3102. He assumed that the planets were all lined up, like horses at the starting gate, lined up on his equinox. Remember, this is down in Pisces on February 18, 3102. Now, astronomers have looked at that, and you can compute. He couldn't compute where those planets were then, and as far as we know, nobody has been able to until modern times. So Richard made a computation over 6,000 years of of history of the degree to which the planets were kind of clustered together. You managed to make a number on that, and then measure that number over a long period of time. Well, here's the 7 classic planets: Saturn, Mercury, Mars, Sun, Jupiter, Venus, and the Moon on that date, that one day. And he found there were 324 times when the stars were as aligned as that. So this isn't very special. But maybe if he threw in some more things. So he threw in the node of the moon, K2. There were only 52 of those, which included K2 in the grouping. Now already this is interesting because K2 is an intersection of 2 circles. It's the intersection of the moon's orbital path with the ecliptic, which is a lot like the intersection of the ecliptic with the equator, isn't it? It's just a direction in space where these things cross. Astronomers use this, Eastern astrologers use this as like another planet. It has qualities. All right. So then he went further, and he said, well, how many of these are actually lined up where Aryabhata thought they were going to be? Near Zeta Piscium, which is what marks that bottom of the cycle. That narrowed it down to 10. It's still in the running. And he got really wild, and he says, well, why don't we throw them all in? We'll throw in Pluto and Uranus and Ceres, minor planets, and Neptune as well. And it got down to 3. It's still there. It's still a good alignment, almost unique. In fact, of those 3, the other 2 are only a month apart, so I think they really only count as 1, because the moon would go around and come back again before things change much. So here we have an almost unique date. It wouldn't work for February 19th or 17th, and Aryabhata knew about it. At least it must have been at least a tradition in that time. Very interesting, because it suggests that the ancients knew about these outer planets and these little minor planets too. Now Pluto is really hard to see. I've seen it a couple times with the telescope. I've never seen Ceres, but you couldn't really know about those things with the kind of instrumentation that we think the ancients had. But they had intuition. They had consciousness. They had the ability to expand their consciousness. And here's evidence that they knew about these things. You see, when we look for concrete evidence of ancient cultures having advanced knowledge and understanding, we shouldn't just be looking at their pottery. We need to look at the things that distinguish them, like their consciousness. Okay, so here's evidence of some kind of ability to know things without the use of the kind of instruments that we know about. And there's other cases. So here's another way. Oh, this whole thing spans about 90 degrees, which is pretty broad, but still, it's almost unique. Here's the look in another kind of way, where you have a circle and the Earth is in the center and the planets are arranged like this. And here's this direction toward Zeta Piscium, they call it Revati. It's the equinox in 500 AD at the very bottom of the cycle. And just opposite that would be the equinox at the top of the cycle, marked by Spica, the brightest star in Virgo, whose name is Chitra, which represents the equinox in some earlier time, 11,000 some BC. So here we are. Aryabhata couldn't have calculated this, we don't think, and nobody since until modern times. Of course, you can do it on your home computer today, or even your cell phone, I guess, but that's another matter. We do things in the physical way. And we're beginning to relate now how this Yuga cycle fits in with the equinoxes in the various constellations. Here's Virgo, and here's Pisces. Well, then one day after church, I went wandering around in my favorite bookstore, Actually, Ted Cutler was filming something in the store. I think he was filming Riemann, but I found this book. And I got so excited about it, I had to tell somebody, I went to Riemann. I walked into the movie. What excited me was this book about remote viewing secrets by Joseph McMoneagle. Now, most of you have probably heard about remote viewing. The idea is that, psychic phenomena, clairvoyance and so forth is pretty undependable. So if you really want to use it for espionage, say, you'd better know when it works and when it doesn't. And so the remote viewers, first at Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, and then later the military had a large program on it. They may still, but they don't talk about it. They worked out a protocol, a very formal protocol for clairvoyance, to see some distant target. They would have targets, and then the people would test themselves. Do they see what they're supposed to see in that target? And that would be confirmed or not. They'd take the people there and see, so they get feedback as part of their training. And but there was a lot of interest in finding out, why they were more accurate sometimes than other times. Very important thing to know. Well, in McMoneagle's book, he talks about the work of one James Spottiswoode. Now, Spottiswoode took all the measurements, the accuracy measurements of these people practicing this remote viewing according to their protocol over a long period of time and from different places on the earth, and went looking for things that they could correlate that with. And you can see, if you probably can't read it, but he says, nothing is known about the physical mechanism of anomalous cognition. That's their technical way of saying ESP. And a first step toward generating a focused hypothesis would be the discovery of a physical parameter that clearly modulates the performance. Something that modulates the psychic phenomena, something that modulates, that changes the ability of people to expand their consciousness into other places or times. Well, what he found was pretty exciting. He laid these out according to sidereal time. Now, we measure our time by the sun. So the sun comes around noontime, that's when the sun's where it is. It comes around there again, it's noontime again. But if you measured it by the stars, you'd have to use a clock that ran 4 minutes fast. That's because the Earth goes around in its orbit about a degree, and it takes 4 minutes to catch up with the amount the sun has changed in position relative to the stars. So if you make a clock that measures by the stars, not by the sun, it runs at a different rate, but it's a clock nonetheless, and that's called sidereal time. So he plotted the effect size, that means the accuracy of their work, against the local sidereal time, which is to say, comparing it to what stars were overhead or on the horizon at that moment. And he found that there was one time of the sidereal day when his accuracy increased 4 times, 400% better, if they did their remote viewing under those conditions than at some other time of day. Of course, people ask me, how can I know which time of day that is? There is a website you can go to if you look up synchronized universe. You'll find that there's a page on that that gives you the time when this happens through the year. But, okay, something at that time of sidereal time, something in the sky there is really increasing these people's ability in psychic, in clairvoyance. What is it? Okay. There, I just marked that time. 13 hours and 30 minutes. So I can look that up on a star chart. Here's a star chart. I showed you this chart before, but I reversed it now so it's black on white. Look what it is. This area in yellow is the part that would be overhead at 13 hours and 30 minutes. It's the part of the sky that the equinox is in the Satya Yuga. It's in Virgo. Beginning to, make some connections here? All right. Let's look at the sky at that time. Here's Virgo. But the Milky Way is spread all the way around, and here's the galactic pole right overhead. Galactic pole now. Galactic pole. We talked about the galactic center, which is over here. Now, in some books you'll read, they'll refer to this stuff and they'll say, well, it has to do with whether the galactic center is above or below the horizon or something. But if you read it carefully, the original paper, the way I read it is it's when the galactic pole is overhead. Now, you remember what happens at galactic poles? You remember the jets from the galactic center would be going up. You shine a flashlight straight up, you see that beam go up. Right? The light comes back to you. So maybe this is the direction of the jets from the galactic center up there, and what comes back to us is some influence. I don't know. But I'm just saying it begins to make some connection. But everything seems to center around Virgo. Now, Virgo is sometimes drawn with their hand out here pointing to the galactic center, which is also pretty interesting. There's also a cluster of galaxies in that area called the Virgo cluster, so that might be, I'm not saying I really know that the galactic center, our galactic center is the center, because this cluster of galaxies is a pretty powerful thing too, so I don't know for sure. At any rate, let's find out about Virgo. So back to the library, pick up the stuff, find about the library. Here's Virgo. First mention of this story of Virgo comes from a poet named Aratus, who lived in the 3rd century BC. And he wrote that justice, is the term he used, justice, which is also known as Dike, and Astrea, and Virgo. Okay? All these names refer to the same goddess. And the story is that in the Golden Age, the age of golden men was the term originally used for that age. Not the golden age, but the golden men. Men who were not tarnished in any way, who shone. In that age, justice walked among mankind. She was very much present everywhere with people. But then they got a little bit more material. In the Treta age, or what they would call the Silver Age, began to tarnish a little bit, and she was uncomfortable with that. She withdrew to the mountains. She would gather some people together, withdraw to the mountains, and lecture them on how they should behave better. But the age of silver men was eliminated, and their descendants were the age of bronze men, fierce, militant men. That was too much for Astrea. And she went up to the sky as the constellation of Virgo. I think she promised to return. All right. This is beginning to make a little more sense now. Here's Astrea ascending to the heavens. Had too much of those guys. You see, she was a goddess. She was an immortal, which means she's always with us. But right now, she's retired to Virgo, withdrawn the energy, not among mankind. Here's a representation of her pointing up either the center of galaxies or that cluster of galaxies with the galactic pole. We don't know which, but that's the traditional way of representing it. These constellations are meaningful. They're not just random somebody's scribble. All right, I'm coming up on the main points here. Bringing all these things together. If we were positioned ourselves somewhere between the earth and the sun, on the direction so we could see Virgo, And every time the sun came by, we snapped a picture and made a movie of that. Maybe we snap a picture every century or something. And if we made a movie of that, it would look like this. Here's our precessing Earth. But at the Kali Yuga, it's most aligned in this direction, and at the Satya Yuga, it's most aligned in, away from that direction. So it strikes me, since we're dealing with projective geometry, where relationships of angles and relationships of points and lines and space and geometry, since we're dealing with that kind of relationship rather than physical distances, I suspect that something about this change of angle, this change of orientation of the spin axis of the Earth is going to be the clue that tells us about how we are interacting with this influence, the modulation of the influence. Because this is the precession. It's said to modulate the influence of that's coming from the galactic center, the Brahma influence that quickens our consciousness. And it has something to do with Virgo. Now, when we say the energy may be in the galactic center, but the influence seems to come from Virgo, it's like you take your compass, and you can turn your compass this way. There are compasses that are made to tilt like this. And at the equator, it points north, and it's level. But we know the magnet's down below. You see? So the energy flow direction and the source of that power don't have to be in the same direction. So this is an unfinished story. But this is as far as I've gotten. And I hope I've shared with you a little bit of the excitement of the development step by step that I've experienced in all of this. Even though the conclusion that the solar dual is not a planet is an unpopular conclusion among many devotees. I can't help that. I got to deal with the facts. And this is where it's led me. But where it has led me, that the study of the energies, the subtle energies that affect our consciousness, is a matter of geometrical relationships, not physical distances, which is a lot, what psychic phenomena is similar in that respect. And astrology is always geocentric. It's always based on these geometric relationships. Now, astrology is a Treta Yuga phenomenon. It's come down to us as recipes, and I think it's part of our job in Dwapara Yuga to reinvent that. The work of Dwapara Yuga is to get from Kali Yuga to Treta Yuga. So if you want to know what you want to do in Dwapara Yuga, think of what it's going to take to get there. It's going to take a disciplined use of intuition. That remote viewing is the first I've seen of the deliberate use of intuition in place of rational knowledge, and in a disciplined way. And it's not surprising that it was the military, because wars are part of Dwapara Yuga. They were part of the entire descending Dwapara Yuga, and they're probably not going to go away altogether in our Dwapara Yuga either. So I'm not surprised that that's where it was initially used. But disciplined use, reliable use of intuition. We have to learn to do that before we graduate to Treta Yuga. So that's an example of that. And I think we need to reinvent astrology from the ground up to understand what these influences are, how they are affecting us, and why they're what they are. I think that's part of our job. So we can see the cosmos does impact our consciousness. We've been ignoring it. We don't have a cosmology. In so many cultures in the past, every culture has had a very close relationship with the stars. And we haven't got that. When I was a kid, I looked at the stars and I just love them. It just filled me with inspiration. And so I got into astronomy. And after a while, the stars became numbers and spectral types. About the dullest things you could think of. Yeah, here's another star. I'll measure its magnitude and color, and da-da. And then one day, I stepped out of the dome. This was in Mexico, in Baja California, at an observatory there that I was just temporarily using, but I was working at night, and I stepped out of the dome. My shift was over at midnight. And I looked up at the sky, and the sky had the wonder, the brilliance, the feeling, the emotional feeling that I had experienced as a child, as a teenager, and it got me into that field in the first place. It was back. And that moment I knew I'd finished astronomy. That was it for telescopes. It's like the story that Tommy Kriyananda tells of pulling out a nail, and you don't know where it's going to come, and then pop, it's out. That was the end of it. I drove down the mountain and went back to Tucson where I was based. I basically walked off the job, and I never thought of it that way at all. But that wonderment, that relationship with the sky is the cosmology that ancient cultures have had forever, and we need to get that back. We've lost that. And with that will come the union of what we think of as science and spirituality. That's part of that picture. And this is what Yukteswar is telling us to do with this, I think. Now, the cosmos impacts our consciousness, so consciousness must be a part of that cosmos. The galaxy is conscious. Think of that. Gopara is back. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know what our timing is, but if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Yes?
So when you were talking about like the lotus coming out of the center of the galaxy, I believe, is that a non-physical or radiation, or what would that be? Is it a black hole pulling all matter into it, or?
Well, they don't understand, at least I don't understand, but sure, matter is circulating around this black hole, whatever that is, and somehow or another comes out as these jets. And it's not a well understood thing at all. So it's a plasma of matter and electricity. And that's one thing that's kind of interest. You know, Yukteswar doesn't use the word energy in the holy science. You speak of that, but it doesn't actually use it. He speaks of fine matters and electricities. And we've been ignoring the electrical aspect of cosmic matters. So we have to think about that. I mean, astronomers think mostly in terms of gravity, but there's energies flowing, and electrons going, and there's a lot happening out there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I didn't quite get what you meant by galactic pole. Can you explain?
Galactic pole. Well, if the galaxy is kind of saucer-shaped, has a bulge in the middle, otherwise it's kind of flat. And so think of that as a plane, like we spoke of the horizon, like we spoke of the plane of the Earth's orbit, or any other such plane. It has a pole. This floor has a pole. It's the direction at right angles to that flat surface. And that's just sort of the definition of a pole in the three-dimensional way. So when I speak of the galactic pole, there's a galactic equator, the center of the Milky Way, and there's a point that's at 90 degrees to that, which would be the galactic pole. And it's the direction. If there's a jet, it would go up in that general direction. I think they begin to see a little bit. I've seen some artist renditions of the data that suggest about the jet being a little bit of an angle to the normal, to the plane of the galaxy, but I haven't followed that one up yet. Yeah.
It's like if you said the saucer is the galaxy, and if it was a sphere, the point at the top would be the pole.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. It isn't a physical object; it's a direction in space. Yeah.
At the center.
At the center. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Anything else? Are you speechless?
Now
Okay, Fremont.
at the end, doesn't otherwise come into the whole theory, but if there's conscious energy pouring forth from the galactic center or what have you, you're also intimating that the entire zodiac, if you will, is offering conscious influences.
Exactly. David Frawley made the speculation that it might be this magnetism of the galactic center that drives all of astrology, and the positions of the planets modify what reaches us. Okay? Imagine, a river flows among rocks. The force is the river itself, but if you rearrange the rocks, you change the pattern of the flow of the water. And so something about the planets' positions are changing this influence. I think it's probably something very worthwhile looking into. Yeah.
I have some readings that says that we are actually a shadow universe. In other words, there's like a projector that projects, and we are just the projection of the projector. And so the way I see it is the dua is actually the projector, the person or the higher consciousness, God, if you will, that is controlling by projecting. So that's why we could disappear, but the eternal is always there. Okay, so I see it that way, that we are actually, like if you're watching a movie, we're what's on the screen. And the projector, person controlling the projection, the film and all that, is just, we are just the shadow universe. And then there's a real original universe that exists in a different dimension.
Yeah. Well, we have to work with what we have, don't we? You start from here and puzzle it out. Yeah. You could say that this was kind of a backward Kali Yuga way of approaching things through rationality, trying to reason my way through Yukteswar's book, and what I really should do is have a higher enough consciousness that I could just know those things and whatever. And presumably Yukteswar did, but he still wrote the book for us. So we have to deal with our own level of reality. Yeah.
I wondered about, what was the geometry? I forgot what it was called.
The projective geometry.
Projective geometry. And you were talking about string theory and such. And another part of the holy science that doesn't have anything to do with the Yugas, Sri Teshwar talks about Om and the atom, maybe particle, I don't know, and time and space all being one. And almost when you're talking about string theory, you wonder if there couldn't be a connection with all of that. Anyway,
I think they're nibbling away at those kind of concepts. And what frustrates them is that physics now can't be visualized. You depend on the mathematics. And if you look back at, and I haven't really collected enough information to document and substantiate it, but if you look back in time, you find greater, and I'm talking back into the descending Kali Yuga and Dwapara Yuga, you find there are more things talked about that cannot be seen, cannot be visualized, cannot be represented concretely. And so we have all these gods and goddesses that represent ideas, represent things that aren't tangible, and so they give them tangible form to identify them. But the idea of thinking of something behind the visible was more popular if you go further back in time than when you go into the depth of the Yuga in the Roman times and such. And so we're now at that point where the mathematicians and physicists are puzzled because they can't visualize these things that mathematics is telling them about. And so you begin to get things that aren't accessible to the imagination or visualization. So you're getting out where intuition will soon be recognized then as the only way to deal with these things. To just sort of feel. Yeah, it's in the back.
You were talking about Virgo and being a higher consciousness constellation, I guess. So there's the month that Virgo, that people are born in Virgo, do they have a higher consciousness, or is that a period of time during the year?
No way.
Higher consciousness? And then you're also mentioning sidereal time. And is there a Virgo period of the day as well? Is it like a microcosm?
There's a time when the constellation is crossing the meridian. And as I said, if you look on the website of Synchronized Universe, that's one word, you'll find such a table. My training is not in astrology, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about it, but I've been waiting for some astrologer to come forth who's willing to look deeply at how these Yuga cycles work from an astrological perspective, either Eastern or Western. When I approach astrologers, which I have, I immediately get a stream of words about, Virgo is this, and it goes way over my head, and it doesn't stick. And I think that it would require quite a little bit of meditation and contemplation on these things before you'd have a really clear answer of what the astrological meanings of these things are. But I think that's a fruitful area of investigation if somebody wants to take it seriously. I'd like to see it done. Yes?
I have a question about sort of mathematics in the Vedas. I recall reading that in the Vedas, or maybe, I think the Vedas, there are supposed to be mathematical formulae and all kinds of knowledge that, according to more regular traditional traditions, this would be an anomaly. So I was curious that you were saying that we can't visualize anymore some of the understandings of the mathematicians. Do you think there's some kind of a relationship between the fact that there's mathematics in the Vedas, so that would be descending Triton, Wapara, and this phenomenon now that we can't make pictures of our understanding of the universe?
I think there is. You're asking if there's a relationship between our inability to visualize things. Then you can know by intuition things that you can't visualize. And so people who have high spiritual experiences are unable to describe what they experience because they can't put it in words. You can't make it concrete. And you can only know it by your intuition. So I think, indeed, to get to Treta Yuga, we have to develop that ability and learn to use it. So, yes.
What does that suggest in your speculation or maybe your meditation about the nature of science and how that's going to change, say, over the next, 500 to 1,000 or 2,000 years?
Oh, I think science and spirituality will join together again. Science is dragging its feet, to put it mildly, denying the existence of anything that isn't objective and independent of the observer. But their own mathematics is pointing to that. The common interpretation of quantum phenomena suggests that the observer has a role in what's observed, and although people object to that, they don't want to put anything of subjective in the system, but they face up to that. So there's that. There's there is more evidence for psychic phenomena than there is for phenomena that is very widely and readily accepted by science, and yet people. There's a certain kind of, I've heard it called scientism, which is almost as dogmatic a stance as any religion ever was against these things. So these things have to be overcome, and I think they will be overcome as we learn to use them practically. I mean, you can't, if it works, you can't deny it. Even if you don't understand it. When the steam engine was invented, it was invented by some guys in a garage, and nobody really understood much about the physics of how it works. So they couldn't improve it until they understood the theory, but the theory came later. And there's this strange notion in science today that if you don't have a theory for it, it doesn't exist. It must be wrong. And I don't know how that crept in, but they've got to overcome that one. I think that's a big obstacle. Science has become very closed-minded and kind of become a materialist scientism. But that'll be broken through, as I say, if we learn to use in a practical way the things that they deny existing. And then, for example, I talked about the idea that electricity could play a role in the universe that may be important, or as important at least as gravity. But astronomers have denied that for a long time. They thought, well, everything's accounted for nicely by Newtonian gravity, and we'll stick with that. And so there's a kind of a movement outside of the mainstream of people who are, and scientifically trained people, who are seriously looking at the electric phenomena in space. I'm going to go to their conference here in a few weeks they call it the electric universe. So they're seriously considering it, but it's outside of the mainstream, you see. And I think we'll see that. The same thing for the cold fusion projects. Mainstream says it doesn't exist. It's happening anyway in people's garages and small laboratories around the world, even though there's no theory to account for it yet. So in time, there's the old adage that the old people have to they have to die out and let the young people take over. The trouble is our system isn't set up to make that happen as readily as we'd like, but it will, I'm sure.
What are you suggesting? Something practical, no doubt.
Yes.
In the theory of the dual, I remember reading something about it coming out of Sirius, how, and there's the legends about all good things come out of Sirius. Am I saying that right? That constellation?
Well, Sirius is a star. And
where is that in relation to Virgo? Is there any correlation?
No, I don't see Sirius entering into this Yuga cycle discussion anywhere. Pardon me?
He was maybe meaning Ceres.
Sirius.
Oh, Sirius, the minor planet. Is that what you mean?
Cruttenden's thesis.
Well, yeah, Walter Cruttenden has researched Sirius in mythology and the history of astronomy and so on, and feels it's important in this discussion. And but I haven't found anything that connects to it in my studies. So that's all I can say. I don't know. Yeah.
Andrew has a question.
Oh, yes, Andrew.
So just to kind of ask a clarifying point, so you're saying that the cycle of the Yugas is not really about our position in space, it's about the rocks in the stream, the position of the rocks in the stream, which is like the planets.
Right, and somehow connected with the orientation of the Earth's axis, which is the precessional cycle. So, because if you think about it, we're 25,000 light years from the center of the galaxy, and if we rotated around another star, that star would be something like 800 times as far away from the sun as we are. And that's an insignificant distance compared to the total distance to the center of the galaxy. So if you looked at it in that physical way, you would say that isn't enough change to make any difference. So something else is at work rather than the physical distance. And that's what interests me about the projective geometry, because it doesn't have any idea of distance. It only has relationship as a way of exploring the world, just by relationship. So some relationship, I think, is driving this. We don't know what it is. Yeah.
In terms of turning things into practice, from what you have presented, could you give some suggestions as to how we could turn that into enriching our daily meditations?
Well, I would say that I've never really thought too much about that, except it is mind expanding. When you think of Yogananda's Samadhi poem and how you expand your whole consciousness when you contemplate these vast distances and extending yourself out into those spaces. And Yukteswar gives, as one of the siddhis, one of the abilities of the advanced yogi, the ability that if he wants to know about the galaxy, he can expand his consciousness to include it and become it. Or the same for the atom. Shrink your consciousness down and explore the atom. So this flexibility of consciousness, I think it helps to think about these vast spaces or these subtle influences and things like that. So for me, it's inspiring to think about these things and mind expanding. Mm-hmm.
In the book, there was an emphasis on connections in Treta Yuga and in the mental age. And the 2 points of demolishing space in our age and time in that age, and your explanation of projective geometry and the hypothesis or thesis that you can demolish time and space at all lean towards a non-Newtonian view of this so-called mechanism, because those elements, dimensions of time and space, if they're shattered or aren't that important, then it's a question of the relationship of our consciousness or worldview to what reality, or to which reality would be the explanation. So your explanation fits in more with the expanded view of reality that the Yuga cycle points us to. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Yukteswar was, just a second. Yukteswar was putting a bunch of clues in here that tell us what direction to go to, and this is one reason I've pursued these studies, to just see what some of those directions might be. Padma?
Well, just to Justin's question, I always hearken back to the fact that Swamiji starts with the Yuga cycles at the very beginning of the Raja Yoga book, essentially setting the tone of why we're going through what we're going through. And then when you take that and recognize that all of the astrology is really our inner astrology as well, and that the Yuga cycles that we're going through are also going through within us until we reach Satya, that highest consciousness, then it, that's what we take into our meditation. That's what it's really all about.
It's really, that's true. Yeah, you do that.
Now, I wanted to introduce Jonathan Davey for a minute.
Okay.
You have another question?
I just wanted to say that your whole presentation was fascinating, and the slides and the video things that you created were just wonderful aids, and it was a fascinating presentation.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure to serve you in this way.
So I would say that probably half of you or more know Janaki Devi and Vyasa, and they were light bearers here in Seattle and lived with us for many years, and we go all the way back 40 plus years to the very beginnings of Ananda. So anyway, they drove up here from Portland, where they're residing now, and we want to thank them and bless them. And can we all stand and send them some alms for their journey? Visit with us a little bit downstairs for prasad, and I wanted to remind you all that for next week we're reading chapter 16 to the end of the book.
I thought it was 18.
Is it the 18th? No. It's
We're
not
only
the
supposed
18th.
to be 17.
No, we only... Huh? No, but we're doing... That's what we're covering next week, even though you've been reading. Yeah. Okay. All right.